Welcome, everybody, to Book Notes. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. I am really excited about the conversation that we are going to have with none other than Dr. Alicia Lola Jones. Book Notes was created this year that we would have the opportunity to have conversation with some of our greatest thinkers and authors and creatives and artists around the country. And I want to thank the entire village, those who are part of the Trinity community and those in the wider community who've been joining us for this Book Notes discussion. And I'm really grateful that we are going to expand this book note series. We have some new authors that you will certainly be blessed by in the future. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with Harold Green, a local poet and artist who recently published a book about Black men and their work in the community. And I think it'll be a very fruitful discussion. He was with us at Trinity several years ago during our Ma'afa and presented a powerful poem about the predicament and the hope within the African-American community. So again, thank you for joining Book Notes with your host, Otis Moss. But let's first begin with prayer. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to learn, to grow, to develop. May you bless this conversation, the words that will go forth, the new ideas that will sprout up in the conversation. And we thank you for all of those who are joining us for this conversation. We also lift up families right now, families in Texas, parents who have lost their children as a result of another mass shooting. We cannot forget them, and they are not only in our hearts, and we offer these prayers, but we seek to be a part of the cadre to change the way in which we operate as a country, especially around gun violence and gun laws. We thank you, oh God, and just ask your blessing and ask that you will hold us and keep us in your embrace. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Well, I am excited tonight because I have the opportunity to introduce one of our absolutely brilliant scholars, a person by the name of Dr. Alisha Lola Jones. She is DC bred, Pentecostal blessed, Oberlin and Yale educated, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. She is an ethnomusicologist. She is European and the classically European trained in European classical music, also go-go, gospel, and some jazz. I like to say that she is our local Google. If you need to know something, call Dr. Alisha Lola Jones, and she will tell you actually what it actually means. And currently, she is now the university lecturer at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. I want to welcome this evening one of our brilliant scholars, a wonderful human being, none other than Dr. Alisha Lola Jones.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm excited to be here.
We are excited to have you. Thank you so much for joining us for Book Notes and to have a conversation on your work, your dissertation, I believe, entitled "Flaming: The Peculiar Politics of Fire and Desire in Black Male Gospel Performance." The book, for those who are listening and watching, you can get a copy just tonight at a discount through Afraware, which is owned and operated by a Sister Nzinga. We thank you so very much. If you would use the code Book Notes Flaming, you'll get a 5% discount on this book just for tonight, because you have been watching Book Notes, hey, with Otis Moss, as we talk to none other than Dr. Alisha Lola Jones, who is our local organic Google. Absolutely brilliant. And so we are grateful and thankful for you watching with us tonight. Dr. Jones, how are you?
I am well. I am so excited to be able to get into the conversation with you. This has been 15 or so years in the making, probably
Mm.
more than that. Yes, so I'm super excited, and the Trinity family always shows Calvin and I so much love. So I'm looking forward to the engagement.
Well, we have great respect for you and your husband, Brother Calvin, and we are thankful for your work. And as you like to say, we first need to set the atmosphere if we are going to have a conversation about flaming. And so, what I want to do, especially for those who may not be from a Pentecostal tradition, may not be familiar with gospel music, and don't even know what an ethnomusicologist is, I'm just going to ask that you would just break down a few things. What is ethnomusicology?
Ethnomusicology is succinctly the field of research where we study the people who make the music and the people who love the music that is being made. So it's very human centered research around music and sound. Some people might call it music anthropology, but many times we find ourselves struggling to kind of give a narrow definition. I'll tell you tonight, it's kind of like music anthropology.
Music anthropology. I think that's helpful for a lot of people who are watching this evening. But you come out of a very specific faith tradition that also informs your work. This book deals a lot with the Pentecostal tradition. Now, some people who didn't grow up in the Pentecostal tradition just frame Pentecostalism in a very narrow sense. Help us to understand, what is Pentecostalism?
Pentecostalism centers around the event of speaking in other tongues. That is one of the crucial or core features of what it means to be Pentecostal, because it is the evidence of the Spirit moving, animating, and indwelling the believer. I often tell people I'm Pentecostal for those who have no idea of the various movements and denominations and organizations. But for those of us who are insiders to Black religiosity, I am more specifically a part of the Word of Faith tradition in terms of my upbringing in the 1980s, 1990s, and in that tradition we spoke in tongues. My mother was holy, so there's more of the Pentecostal part, and my dad was AME Zion. And then when they had my sister and I, by that time, they were firmly in the Word of Faith, charismatic networks, and since then we've kind of blossomed into something else.
Well, you have these Pentecostal roots,
Mhm.
holiness connections, and
Mhm.
this deep love of music. Now, your book focuses on the Pentecostal tradition, but why is it important to make the distinction in connection to gospel music and the Pentecostal movement?
Yeah, so Pentecostalism really takes seriously. Um, I'll borrow from the UCC church that God is still speaking, that God is still moving, that there can be a manifestation and occurrence, a an inflaming of the people of God when they gather and when they get together for worship. And this is something that is expected for a competent gospel musician who is a worship leader in the sanctuary, and who might also be a part of the music industry. The ability to take people there to an encounter with God is an important, lucrative aspect of what music ministry means in these networks where there's Pentecostalism and gospel music being practiced.
Now, you gave a key word that you deal with in your book, the worship leader, and I led with just saying setting the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So, in your book, you talk about the importance of setting the atmosphere and the role of the worship leader, and the worship leader within certain traditions is usually male many times and presents in a particular way. So give us a framing of how you were investigating this idea of worship leader within this tradition and what that means in the tradition you're examining.
Yeah, so worship leadership, being a catalyst, a facilitator, in many ways, the ever ready worshiper is an important part of gospel music performance. A person that folks can count on to live the life they sing about and maybe even preach about um, on and off the stage. Worship leadership, I think, is key because there are archetypes, there are figures that are expected to be a part of really good Black gospel or Pentecostal worship. Uh, Often there are male leaders and there are female leaders. However, there's something about being stereotyped as a flamboyant worship leader that prompts a lot of conversation, a lot of scrutiny, as well as can be a burden for a person to navigate and their own imagination of how people might receive their ministry. And I wanted to follow those stories. I wanted to follow this anxiety about how men's identity fueled their abilities as competent worship leaders or not, how it might be a distraction and a deterrent. And it turns out a lot of people had plenty to share with me about this idea of the stereotype of the flamboyant choir director.
Now, I'm glad that you led with that because you use the term flaming and you frame it in a variety of ways, that it means several different things. It can be a theological framing, there's this
Mhm,
sociological, and then there's coded.
mhm.
So share with us when the term flaming is utilized within this tradition, how is it coded? What's the sociological framing of it, and what's the theological?
Mhm, mhm. Well, you'll notice in the book title, the I start intentionally with a question mark because I am a cisgender heterosexual woman who is not in the population that I'm researching. I wanted to signal with the title that I understood that the politics surrounding these conversations were fraught and that I was not presuming to be a card carrying expert, but rather a person interrogating what folks assumed or presumed to be true. So some folks at a glance who may not look at the back of the book or as you did check out the introduction, which is what all good scholars do, we check out the introduction. Some of them would see flaming and uh, anticipate that the conversation would be salacious, that I would be digging into gossip surrounding the idea, the vernacular term flaming, which refers to a flamboyant man who gives a lot of cues that would suggest they are likely to be queer, queer in their sexual orientation, or queer in their gender expression and presentation, or peculiar, just socially awkward. I also think of flaming with regard to the Holy Spirit and the speaking in tongues. Flaming as it relates to being able to diffuse critics, people who come against you, to be able to render their critique as useless, and so much so that it goes up in flames. And so I give about four working definitions about how flaming can be heard as an empowering component socially, culturally, religiously, but also disempowering when it is used in a way to diminish our kin within our culture.
Now, what I love that you do in the book is that you build this foundation, starting out by talking about the underrepresentation of Black men, but yet Black men holding spaces of power, and then men, whether they are perceived as being queer or hetero, holding particular positions, and then also marginalizing women in many ways.
Mhm.
So help us with this idea of the spaces
Mm,
within Pentecostal tradition that are considered to be exclusive male spaces, and how are they varied?
yeah. Well, when I was doing doctoral research in Chicago, I was fortunate enough to be able to witness some workshops on the defeminization of the congregation, the pew. These workshops addressing anxiety surrounding how the worship experiences in our churches were centered on women's sensibilities, they would
Mm,
say. And as I looked at these workshops and evaluated the handouts and brochures, I realized that there was a there were some legitimate concerns, and then there were some others that I think deserved a little bit more attention and pushback. And so this research really does take seriously those concerns. One of which I found was that the worship was too sentimental in this
mm,
person's experience, and that instead they wanted to have worship that prepares men for war, whether it's spiritual
mm,
war or even street credibility. They wanted these men not to seem soft, and I, began to engage music ministers around the country through various denominations to ask, what is there something to this concern about men being soft? Should worship be a space where people are preparing for war? And what war are we preparing for? And when I really walked through the logic of some of the terms and phrases that were being perhaps parroted, folks actually were willing to stop and think and listen to what it is we were just saying, perhaps mindlessly, in order to get people impassioned in our various programs. Um, and so there are spaces that we may not have thought of specifically, but we move with those spaces, not realizing that they have become gendered, like the pulpit. The pulpit, though there are women increasingly occupying the pulpit is often imagined as a man's domain, or the church pews are being imagined as a woman's domain, a lay person's domain. The choir loft, though it is uh, um, taken, though there are participants in the choir loft who are along various gender lines, there seems to be a dominance of a feminine perception. And the instrumentalist pit is this sort of unmarked category where not only it is presumed to be male these days, even though historically women were the instrumentalists and the music educators. Um, it's also presumed to be a space of heterosexual identity. When we listen to the comedic sketches that are distributed throughout gospel music circles, a lot of people talk about how instrumentalists run up and through the choir loft and the congregation, for example.
mm,
Same thing can be said of the pulpit ministry. And I trace that. I take seriously what people say about um, how one identity and sexual orientation may actually be an unspoken or whispered criteria for competency in ministry, virility in the pulpit, for example. So that's a longer response to gender and even sexualized conversation about gendered spaces.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that piece about gender spaces because I had a question that popped into my head when I was reading your work. The idea that you have this gendered pulpit, you have certain spaces that are for certain people, and
Mhm.
quietly whispered, we really want someone who operates in this manner. Could you also frame that for other organizations? I think about civil rights organizations
Oh, yeah.
where you
Oh, yeah.
have gendered space
Mhm.
where men have traditionally been in the leadership role, but the majority of the organization is women. The
Yeah.
majority of the financial support is women.
Yeah.
The second thing that I was curious around your thoughts on is the framing of the preacher. as womanizer, the
Mhm.
framing of the worship leader or the choir director in a queer framing. But the other thing is that other traditions may celebrate that. I think of, certain Black Hebrew Israelites. I think of certain groups that then lift up that idea of this muscular
Mhm.
idea of what it means to be in leadership, that women have to be placed as a thing in
Mhm.
reference to that. Would you say, would that connect?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, here from a scholarly perspective, I can hear my predecessors somewhere in my intellectual room. Dr. Burnham, for example, would say, this is precisely why we need to be as specific as possible when we are describing our Black culture. Because for many people, they have no idea that in Pentecostalism, there's organizations, there are adjacent organizations. They have no idea about Hebrew Israelites. Oh, time and time again, I see the butting of heads when an Ashkenazi Jewish person encounters a
Mm,
Hebrew Israelite, and we're having conversations about pronouncing Hebrew, right? So this specificity is so important for precise analysis. Absolutely. What you said initially with regard to civil rights, I think of the import of discussing the gendered spaces and roles, the historical gendering of those spaces and roles, largely because now, because Black women are decreasing in their role as music educators, we are seeing in congregations where there is compensation for music ministry, women being pushed out of those paying roles and men being apprenticed into those roles in a same gender homosocial manner. You know, that is left up to the integrity of the personnel working with those houses. I do push and I do intimate that as that is occurring, what happens is women who might be the lead worshiper, vocalist, might be the person who's not compensated, but could also be the person who's a single mother who could
mhm.
use that sort of support, who might be, a person pursuing their education. Um, and just thinking about how even in the subtlety of referring to a person as a vocalist versus a vocal musician can keep them situated in an uncompensated arrangement
Wow.
or in a arrangement where they're being exploited. So that specificity is definitely important. And depending on the community, they see no problem in the privileging of a male voice. Now, the benefit of being a professor in ethnomusicology who happens to research religious music is that I get students of various religions all the time. And so my Sunni Muslim student who just defended her brilliant dissertation, she read my early manuscript and she saw some of the assertions made about Islam and those who are followers of Islam. And she said, I mean, yeah, the men are in the mosque, but not because it is more inviting, it's just understood within our faith. The women's domain is here and the men's domain is here, but it is not thought of in comparison, at least from her more orthodox position, in opposition to, say, a Christian experience.
Mm.
Um, so, yeah, that specificity is very important.
Now, one of the things you're going to have to do for us, Dr. Jones, is you're going to have to do some decoding. You're going to have to do
Okay.
some decoding around language, and I really want the audience to hear you decode some songs. So the first thing that we want to do is talk about the space that queer men have been given. One, but two, also a space of acceptance, but at the same time, don't ask, don't tell, um, of coded language, but not given that space in other spaces outside of the Black religious tradition. Help us understand the idea that you can have this space, but in other spaces, you are excluded.
Yeah, I think one of the methods we can use as an anthropological researcher is following the money. Um,
Mm,
and so in the congregation, it's predominantly women, and those who are gospel enthusiasts are typically women. Those are the patrons of the arts, if you will. And so the don't ask, don't tell arrangement persists largely because the men with whom I've spoken are unsure about how women will receive them should they know or should it be confirmed that they are same gender loving individuals. I've had some women call into radio shows where I've been interviewed where they say, well, what am I supposed to do with a gay man? And my response is, sister, we've had gay men around us. They just haven't told you. These are your godfathers. These are your uncles who never sired children or who sired children and never fully lived into who they believed they were. They've always been present. It's just whether or not you've been permitted to come into their private lives. Um, I don't know why these sorts of uh, divisions persist because, in many ways, we already know.
right.
Uh, Scholars of color have said there's no such thing really in our culture of the closet. It's just whether or not we name what our existence is. Um, and for me, I'm actually less interested in confirming the sexual orientation of the folks whose names were brought up to me and more interested in how we are experiencing them as queer and why we value deciphering, interpreting those aspects of who they are so much. That's what interests me. In many ways, I do have a sense of folks' sexual orientation, and it often challenges what has been assumed. Like with Jungle Cat, one of the favorites that people mention who pole dances for Jesus, people typically think he's gay, but he describes himself as tantric celibate and heterosexual. That is enough right there, how he self identifies. Let's just talk about that as opposed to trying to
Now
confirm.
back up and help folks out. Jungle Cat, pole dance. You're gonna have to break it down. They haven't read the book. They haven't seen the examination of this that you do. So help people out. You just threw something out, and people are like, who is that? A cartoon character? They said Jungle. What are you talking about? What is this?
Yes, yes. Jungle Cat is one of the most just sweet individuals that I met early on in my research. It was just it dropped into my lap. One of my best friends, Eunice, sent me his video and asked me to interpret what was going on. And I interviewed him, which is a aspect of our methods in ethnomusicology. Going and interviewing a person. I've even seen some of his presentations and performances. At any rate, during his interview, he told me he was raised Baptist in North Carolina, had never seen pole dancing, and saw a pole fitness commercial. Um, it resonated with him. And if you look at the pole fitness website, it's like very 80s, like late 70s Farrah Fawcett, like, aerobics aesthetics. So it resonated with him. And he was a librarian by day and a
Mm,
self-taught pole fitness buff by night. One Sunday, he decided to commemorate having taught himself pole fitness for a year and recorded his worship on to put it online. Um, and the internet blew up. It was covered in Huffington Post, Washington Post.
wow.
Um, and he responded to my query and told me that as a Baptist, he moved to DC, started going to a very prominent Pentecostal church there, and also started exploring world religions. And Tantra was a religion and a way of life that resonated with him, and how Tantra teaches celibacy was really important for him. So he describes himself as a tantric celibate heterosexual man.
So thank you for breaking that down for you just say jungle cat. Because I think it's a really fascinating piece in your book that also helps us walk through this piece I was saying decoding. I want you to walk through some decoding language in terms of music, in terms of words that are used. I mean, you use the example that is quite powerful, talking about Derek Coley and his singing and
Mhm.
the manner in which that he uses music and his singing. You walk through the way in which the gendered maleness of God functions in a coded way. So help those who are listening how this functions from your studies.
Yes. So Daryl Coley is one of the male vocalists that men always say is like the ideal stylizer in gospel music. Like he is always the one to which people bow. They just say he is goals. Daryl Coley actually, before Donnie Mcclurkin shared his testimony of um, no longer being homosexual, Daryl Coley had shared that testimony in the early 90s. And it coincided with him divulging that he was dealing with diabetes. And uh,
Now go for it with the diabetes piece. Please explain for those who are listening why that's important, what you're sharing.
Yes. So over the course of the book, I build on that, but I will say that I mentioned diabetes because the title of his piece in Gospel Today with Dr. Teresa Hairston described him as being delivered from both diabetes and homosexuality. Now, I will say for us as believers, I put diabetes as well as other blood related diseases in the same
Mm,
realm,
mm,
largely because of the taboos surrounding diabetes and other blood related diseases, such as um, the events following the Tuskegee syphilis experiment.
mm.
That was a blood related occurrence. HIV/AIDS. I place all of them together because, again, I'm less interested in the specific diagnosis and more interested in how the stigma works within our
Mm.
community. Why are these particular diseases stigmatized in the way that they are? And yes, the diabetes is often a symptom of HIV/AIDS diagnosis. So that's why I just go ahead and place it all together. But following that um, interview with Dr. Hairston, there was traction. Actually, I know this from my father, who worked in and owned radio stations. That he delivered me became a hit by Daryl Coley. And then he recorded a few other songs about deliverance. And this narrative of deliverance in his music was bolstered, I assess, in his personal narrative of being delivered in a manifold way. Diabetes, depression, as well as homosexuality. And so when he begins to sing of deliverance, not only are we hearing the freedom that comes with being liberated through the spiritual work of fasting, prayer, and the move of the spirit, but there are sonic cues that he deploys, such as the rolling of the tongue, the alveolar R, are one of our wonderful words
Yeah,
from
repeat that word again so everybody knows that one.
alveolar R, the rolling of the R, where he sings that God thrilled him. This sounding of thrill can be heard by a compulsory heterosexual audience, those of us who presume heterosexuality. We can hear it and understand that this is a testimony about his deliverance from homosexuality, his deliverance from other ailments that he shared in the article. However, those who would undertake a queer listening, a same gender loving listening, can hold that dominant cultural perspective and place it into conversation with the how that sounding of thrilled and the word itself can also generate meanings of sensuality, intimacy, and the use of he being a term that can be about God, but it can also be heard humorously as a way of referring to one's beloved. And these ways of being multilingual, um, uh, many of my informants and conversation partners have talked about it as their tool for survival.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that conversation that you do with Daryl Coley was was fascinating to me,
Mm.
and then with Donnie McClurkin, but then you jump in there and then you put Luther Vandross at the same time, and you're bringing this conversation around the way in which men present in these varied spaces in a unique way. So help us understand the challenges for McClurkin, and then the presentation of what Luther Vandross does.
Oh yeah, I consider Luther Vandross as a part of this constellation of witnesses because our music has not been developed in isolation, right?
Mm.
There's a continuum between the religious and non-religious. And it dawned on me as I was looking at footage of Luther in England that the aesthetic of his live video looked a lot like the aesthetic of Daryl Coley's video in terms of the attire and even the entrance and the musicality that both of them demonstrated as they entered in. And I was just like, listen, I'm just going to point out the resemblances. Both of them talked about their fight with diabetes. So there's some kinship here in many ways, right? Um, Donnie McClurkin, I tell people I really resisted um, putting Donnie McClurkin in because I didn't want to take cheap shots. I over and over, I wanted to be ethical. I wanted to be mature as a believer dealing with these topics. However, Donnie McClurkin gave so much material in his autobiography and his interviews that illuminated some of the devices or tools, customs that people used within gospel music networks. You know, he enters into the conversation as a person that we know most popularly as describing himself as homosexual. And most recently, you know, he proposed to Nicole C. Mullen. Folks were kind of uh, a little puzzled by that. Social media broke when they saw this announcement. And I, as a believer, as a person who understands deliverance to be a real thing, whether it's healing, um, you know, people letting go of alcohol or drug abuse. But there's something about when people talk about deliverance from homosexuality where our nonverbal communication just ramps up and there's a side eye and an eye roll and a leaning in and a whisper and a leaning back and a head swivel. And that was all occurring on social media when he announced his desire to get engaged to Nicole. And so I start off the book talking about that moment or writing about that moment and just how, you know, it may seem odd to us that as a person delivering from homosexuality could be a believable heterosexual partner. However, there are many folks in our midst, many pastors, music ministers, etc., who have various arrangements and who are very upfront with their partners about their tastes, about what they want their partner to be able to fulfill or not fulfill in their relationships. And we need to stop kidding ourselves. These things are happening. So he gives me a great opportunity to mention some other headlines of folks who have divulged, yeah, I had this past. This is what I liked from that sexual history. This partner was willing to go with it, or we were willing to have our two lives and just make sure we had kids together and that we were on each other's insurance policy. All these configurations have been existing for quite some time. and we just haven't talked about it. So I talk
Now,
about
what's
it.
really fascinating what you do is there's this tension where on one side you have within in the Black church that wants to condemn any human being that may be queer, that has a different orientation. But yet, as you just said, when someone then presents and says, "I've been delivered," there's eye rolling saying, "No, that's who you are innate." And so there's this tension of this organic theology bumping up against a doctrinal theology where we
Mhm.
struggle with what we know and what we've been told. It seems to be
Yeah,
bumping consistently, and you keep bringing it up in the book in terms of how people function.
yeah. I mean, and I had to ask myself, as a trained theologian and caregiver, a person who has experience as a pastor, how do I counsel a woman who is, or a person who is partnering with another person that describe himself as delivered from homosexuality? What is my ethics surrounding that shepherding? And this is part of why I included this information in the book, because there might be a person more fit to walk with that candidate for marriage than I would be, according to my convictions and my understanding of how we are wired with regard to arousal, voluntary and involuntary responses to stimulation. You know, my understanding of biology can rub up against, what the tradition has told me all of my life. And yet, I believe the faith is durable enough for some really good questions. I believe it. I really do believe it.
Now, there's a piece that you deal with in the whole deliverance aspect of the book where you talk, and I'm not sure, I don't remember the gentleman's name. He blew up on the internet, said I'm delivered at a Kojic, was it convention or conference?
Yeah,
But there was
Andrew
a
Caldwell.
pastor who had this altar call, and this gentleman said, "I've been delivered from this," so on and so on. But then which I didn't know, that they were then traveling together to show that, yes, this person has been delivered. So I'm condemning, but at the same time, I'm pimping. At the same time, I want to utilize your experience so that I can expand my particular ministry and be known as the delivering that was fascinating to me. That was really an eye-opening within because I'm not familiar with the Kojic circles in
Yeah.
terms of functioning.
I was familiarizing myself with the repertoire of sermons that use really harsh language to describe people who are gender nonconforming or gender non-binary, who come annually to the convenings, using terms like sissy, which is a pejorative term, to describe people, to insult them in order to prompt them to come forward
Mm,
for their deliverance. And I get the passion. I get the focus on making sure that folks are right with God. I also get being known by our love. I've seen
mm,
love so awesome that it humbles. I've seen love so bright that it transforms. I've seen love so precious that it causes us to love our enemies. And I want to excel and be known by that love. This work has transformed me as I've asked myself, am I known by my love or am I known by
mhm,
my insulting? Am
mm,
I known by how
mm,
I have made a person feel less than? I have am I known by how I have fueled a person's suicidal ideations? Have I really promoted the idea that God does not love this person and that they are not fearfully and wonderfully made? Though I've not done these sorts of deliverance rituals, my presence, my affiliation is a cosign. And so I want to be in conversation with individuals to ask about the quality of the love, to
Mhm.
ask about what constitutes true love, and are we being known by it?
Mm.
Andrew Caldwell is a gift that keeps on giving. I believe now he refers to himself as a gospel comedian. Whoever has
Mm.
surrounded him has really helped him monetize the moment. Um, and there is a lot in his story, though, even though there are giggles that have come from that incident in 2014. He actually helped to reveal some of the ableism in the work that
Mm.
folks are saying that they're doing. Pastor Kim Burrell had described him as a deaf and dumb, someone with a deaf and dumb spirit because of
Mm.
his audible difficulty with particular sounds.
Mm.
And for Pentecostal, the inability to be agile with one's speech is an entire theological realm. But when he heard her critique him, I have to take seriously that he was not only off put, he was discouraged that
Mm.
a vocalist that he had loved would actually chastise him because of what he confirmed to be a speech pathology and developmental issues that as a child he had to walk through.
Wow.
And so how is it that a person seeks deliverance and we then exchange an affliction for another affliction?
Wow.
The math is not mathing, we say. The
Mm.
math is not math.
Mm. Well, I'm going to pause right here for a quick commercial. For those
Mhm.
of you who are watching right now, you are listening to Dr. Alicia Lola Jones. She's an ethnomusicologist. She serves as professor at Indiana University and is now lecturer at the University of Cambridge in none other than the United Kingdom. You can pick up her latest book entitled Flaming, The Peculiar Theopolitics of Fire and Desire in Black Male Gospel Performance. And you can do that through Afroware. That is a sister-owned bookstore on the South Side at Trinity United Church of Christ and also in Oak Park. If you use the code Book Notes Flaming, you'll receive a discount only for today so that you can read this book. I tell you, it's a tremendous book dissertation. She goes in depth. I'm telling you, she goes in. She gets it all, everything. Um, and she does a tremendous job. So I would ask that you would pick this up, and I hope that if you are in ministry, that you will get this book because it's really going to open your eyes. If you've come out of the Pentecostal tradition, the holiness tradition, whatever particular tradition, you'll have a greater understanding not only of the tradition but of the coded language, of the double entendres that are working within our tradition that we sometimes, many times, we choose to ignore. We choose to ignore. So again, please pick up the book Flaming. Also, if you have a question for Dr. Alisha Lola Jones, guess what? The lines are open. If you are on StreamYard, if you're on Facebook, if you're on YouTube, please send in your questions. Our digital pastor is waiting for you to raise a question to Dr. Alisha Lola Jones. I'm telling you, she is our local Google. She can talk about anything because I mean, that the way that brain works, she's so rich with so much knowledge. And it is always wonderful to have a conversation with her. Now, I want to continue the discussion because something that really troubled me and really hurt me as I was reading the book, along with the conversation you're talking about with Brother Williams, is again, I forget the minister or bishop's name in the Kojic tradition. The manner in which you have a section of his sermon where he uses framing, talking about women, and obviously talking about Black women, and using everything in the negative, everything that is destructive, and saying these just very harsh words and framing women as the problem or as a disease. And I was completely blown away by the usage of this language that denigrated women in such a way in order to make this point that you as a man need to have muscular Christianity. Was challenging. Tell us a little bit about this peculiar tradition where men have to denigrate in order to be elevated.
Yeah. Um, when I present on that particular sermon, I do often give some sort of trigger warning, because he used terms to describe women's menstrual cycles, um, feminine attire, who they are in terms of submissive postures, as being weaker, as being a punishment unto death.
Mm,
And so the focus was to impress upon those who um, did not conform to heterosexual and conventional gender um, roles and presentations, that approach to impressing upon people was so shaming and so insulting that I literally had to make a list of the dimensions of how insulting it was, how transphobic it was, so
mm,
fearful of trans people, how gynophobic it was, fearful of women's gynecological anatomy. And I will say, I am working on a piece dealing with sermons. There's a lot of sermons where folks exhibit this anxiety about women's reproduction.
mm,
I saw, for example, Pastor McClurkin preach at one of sister churches to Trinity St. Sabina, and he preached about the woman found in adultery and how she had the stench of sex on her, and how in that same sermon he moved to how Christ was made with divine, I want to say, I'm grossly reducing, but the general realm was that Christ was divinity wrapped up in some sort of semen, all of which demonstrate gynecological phobia. And that to me is more evidence of some unresolved areas in his reality. But he's not alone. There are folks who we understand to be heterosexual, who are married, who who talk in similar terms. And so you mentioning this is very, very important. As a woman who is invested in women's empowerment, God is something else. That God would lead me, the creator would lead me to do men's studies in order to reveal some dynamics of misogyny. Many
mm,
of the feminine, masculine men that I encountered said, I experienced misogyny. I
mm.
experienced disdain and dislike because of my feminine attributes. And I had to think about that and say, huh, like, what does that say about me to adopt terms like effeminate, which diminishes men who have a feminine masculinity? What does it say about me to chastise a man for having attributes of a woman when women are the ones overrepresented in the pews as givers, as patrons of the arts, as those, who are turning water into wine? Why would I
Mm.
then say to men that that is a bad thing, that they want to be like these women we can count on? And furthermore, in the research, I realized that effeminacy actually originated in this country as a racial slur toward
Mm,
us as being a lady of the races. And I brought this in the introduction toward the end. I know it's like high octane, but for those who want to have a sense of why effeminacy is just not the look, check out that I offer a term like feminine masculinity to describe that realm. And then conversely, for those who have a masculine femininity, instead of terms like butch. Um, unless they want that term. I like to use those other terms to kind of massage those realms. Um, but that sermon is not unique. I found many like that, not just in Kojic. I found some
Mm,
televised sermons, but
mm,
what happened with Andrew Caldwell gave me an opportunity to talk about ability, to talk about developmental issues, and how that gets kind of conflating and convoluted in the spiritual work of deliverance, um, for someone who had a sexual history as homosexual and whose partners were men in ministry, men in pulpit ministry.
Well, I want to give a shout out to several people. Edward C. Davis, who graduated from University of Cambridge, said you will bring a lot to his alma mater. Thank you so much. Sister Portia, who you know very well, Portia Gates, she states, "Come on, sister, come on, keep just speak it and teach it. Just do the thing." Reverend North, Shakima says, "You speak." So you have a whole crew of people who are giving digital amens
Thank,
as you are speaking. Now I
thank
want
you.
to shift gears a little bit because you speak about this idea, lifting up Nathan Carter's work,
Mhm.
talking about the counter tenor.
Yeah.
What is a countertenor? And help us understand how Nathan Carter, well, who he is, number one, but number two, how he composed his work that offered space for
Mhm.
people to sing in a particular way out of their own gifts.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Nathan Carter was a stalwart of Morgan State University well into the 2000s, and there are often angels of music houses, right? These individuals who set the philosophy for musical institutions, and Dr. Nathan Carter definitely set the philosophy for what it means to be a musician out of Morgan State University. I remember as a high schooler at Duke Ellington School for the Arts going down to hear Morgan State Choir and just seeing Dr. Nathan Carter. We would call him the Black Beethoven. He had the bell sleeves and the velvet blazer and drove up in a Porsche. And we were like, goals. Who is this guy? Um, and then he had the pedagogy, the culturally relevant pedagogy to match what he was doing in terms of the performance on the stage. And so, anyone who comes to Morgan State, if you say Dr. Nathan Carter, you will have a lengthy conversation about Black excellence. A countertenor is a person who is a rare vocal, a rare high singing male. This is a vocal classification that exceeds a tenor. This is a person who, in years gone by, might have been described as a male soprano, and whose vocal range uh, also is adjacent to who we know of as falsettists, like DeBarge, folks in Earth, Wind, and Fire, etc. The difference is that a countertenor would tell you that um, they get this designation because they are formally trained in European art and operatic music. So they are a concert performer who uses no amplification. That is how they are trained. So that's one big distinguishing factor. They can fill a concert hall without any miking.
Mm.
Ideally, they are trained well.
Now, before you go on, you have to do something. You blew myself and Monica away some time before because we had no idea that so many people, one, use amplification, and two, many of the people that we think are singing are not singing. Could
No.
you just help us out with that a little bit there?
Yeah, yeah. So, amplification, I mean, popular music, we have access to miking, and increasingly on operatic stages, they are doing subtle miking, not only to amplify, but to stream and record the performance. But it is a part of like your street credibility as an operatic um, singer to be able to use your larynx in a way where you can project as well as fine tune your sound as it is being produced. So it's a whole realm of conversation and artistry. And I don't say it in a way to diminish those who use amplification, because there are those who understand sound engineering techniques that I still, endeavor to learn from. Um, the countertenor would tell you that there are those that might, in uninformed settings, think that they are uh, um, pretending to sing that high, or that they are baritones behaving badly. But a true countertenor, in many ways, will strongly resemble a mezzo soprano or soprano sound
Mm.
if you don't see them. And so you actually have several amazing countertenors there in Chicagoland. I want to shout out G. Thomas Allen, who recently recorded with Ricky Dillard, a Chicagoan. He's the professor at Columbia College who opens up Ricky Dillard's album with the doxology. Check him out. He does the thing. Um, Countertenors are my way of dealing with a sort of extreme or most peculiar instance of men who sing high, and some of the stereotypes surrounding men who sing high. Often this idea that, maybe it's an indication of their queer potential. And we know that there are countertenors who, in the European tradition, are the heroic romantic figure.
Mm.
um, there are countertenors who are heterosexual, who are married, who love their wife. And there are women who absolutely love the countertenor sound, and who liken it to historical designations that have fallen out of practice, like the castrato. Um, uh, Farinelli is one of the most popular castrati in the world, men who were castrated or physically mutilated in service of the church. And I do want to say that Cambridge, where I'm now an associate professor at, thank God they let me transfer my tenure. They just started their new ranking system. Praise Jesus. It is actually a destination for countertenors.
Mm.
And so sharing this work with them and exposing them to multi-genre countertenors like my good friend Patrick Daly, Ken Austin, Cortez Mitchell, these Morgan State University countertenors has really been an awesome opportunity to have their music played for countertenors in the UK. Yeah.
Well, you have a question coming from Shakima North. She's wondering if Dr. Jones has done any work or has any thoughts on BB and CC's music, with a song like Addicted to Love coming from two cisgendered heterosexual people, and how they through their lyrics may or may not be signifying what acceptable love looks like.
Thank you. I happen to be a big Winans fan. I remember when Addicted Love came out. I'm a huge Winans family fan. Whether it's by marriage or by blood and birth. I love the Winans. Yeah, there was a huge controversy surrounding language with their music for quite some time. They too are progeny of the Church of God in Christ, the Kojic Church, and the controversy was around them explicitly saying Jesus in their music, that it was too ambiguous. And I think that ambiguity is a part of the undercurrents that I deal with in the book, where there were these amorous sort of sentiments that were conveyed through the songs, and in many ways there were too many lines blurred where it felt more romantic than it did worshipful. Now here's the interesting part. Many of our hit makers in gospel music have shared that they have tapped into the amorous, the romantic, in order to grasp language for a gospel music hit to their creator. Uh,
Mm.
Edwin Hawkins famously has done it. I remember he's my godfather in my mind, and I know a beloved person in the Trinity community. Richard Smallwood has talked about um, a song, "You Are My Dwelling Place." That I emphasize, "You Are My Dwelling Place," but y'all know the song if you're a Smallwood fan. He had posted that that song was originally written for a love interest in his teenage years, and then he repurposed it. It happens all the time, and we joke about it, calling it "Jesus is my boyfriend" music.
Mm.
Um, so it gets a little complex with BB and Cece because they're siblings, and
Mhm.
there was also, a little confusion about who they were as siblings, being a duo, and being hit makers. There's plenty to think about there. My colleague Claudrina Harold, uh, who just released a book, When Sunday Comes, she addresses
Mm.
the Winans. So check her out. Not my topic, but if you want to read a little bit more about them, her recent book would be great, When Sunday Comes.
Now, would you also say that that's also done on the flip side? So I would think of, say, Marvin Gaye, who taps into the spiritual, to the
Mhm.
gospel tradition,
Yeah.
and then flips that and infuses that in his music to bring it to a level of ecstasy that is not the same without him tapping into that.
Oh yeah. The interesting thing about Marvin Gaye, who is a Washingtonian, he's a falsettist. He's a falsettist, so this is helpful in terms of drawing distinctions. A person who uses a stylistic device. However, there's something about the quality of that stylistic device that doesn't sound as though it's a classification. It sounds more temporary and emotive than
Mm.
it does like it is their comfortable range. He actually is a part of the Hebrew Israelite legacy. I believe his
Mm.
father was, and his cousin, the artist, the neo soul artist, Donnie, pointed that out.
Mm.
And in many ways, there were conversations around tensions between Marvin Gaye and his father with regard to his father's flamboyance and how that was
Mm.
experienced. And many would say that that was a part of what came to a head when he was killed at his father's hand.
Wow.
But yeah, Marvin Gaye taps into sonic cues of rapture, of ecstasy, of sensuality. These are what we call sonic semantic symbols, ways of emoting. Whether and semantic is the term that we use for the meaning found in words and symbols, right? When he, does his hootie, ad libs, or he hums, or he might yell. Um, these sorts of ecstatic sounds people readily associate both with protest and with the boudoir, depending on the topic at hand. Absolutely. Mhm.
Well, Dr. Jones, it has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you this evening. You are a wealth of knowledge. You are brilliant. And I say again to everyone who is watching that you want to pick up Flaming, the peculiar Theopolitics of Fire and Desire in Black male gospel performance. You can pick it up through Afroware Books on the South Side. That's Trinity United Church of Christ over there on the other side of the world. It's over there at Oak Park and Maywood. But it is Black owned, and we are delighted to be in partnership with Afroware. I also want to thank our entire team who is behind all of this. Everyone from Cleo, the maestro, who makes sure that StreamYard is moving forward, Donna, who manages and makes sure everybody is on point, and our number one digital pastor, Reverend Jasmine. We thank you for the work that that you are doing, and the entire media team. And of course, our guest this evening, Dr. Alisha Lola Jones. And we are so appreciative to you. If you have any closing words that you'd like to share with us, we give you the floor at this time.
Well, I just want to thank you and your staff, people of Trinity, for their continuous support. I always know when I get an opportunity to connect that there will be a exciting sharpening growth. I grow and learn, and there's nothing like a Trinity United Church of Christ event ever. There's never anything like it. So I just thank you. I thank you, the community. And I do want to return to the idea of being known by our love, that at the center of this research and the work that I do, shining a light on the power of our music and culture, that there is something transformative about loving well. And a part of loving well is seeking and pursuing understanding until we are passionate about the other side. I think it is persuasive. I think it is responsible. It's ethical, and it is holy. I enjoy walking alongside ministerial staff and congregations, thinking through these issues as a person of faith. I have not lost my faith. It has increased. And I know so many men whose stories are explored in this book, who have caused faith to rise up for me. And so I hope to share those stories with you through the book and through in-person engagement in the future. Thank you all.
Well, you've done a magnificent job. Thank you, Dr. Alicia Lola Jones. And to everyone who's been watching Book Notes, we thank you for being with us, because there is a blessing in reading, and there is a joy in learning, and there is elevation in dialogue. And we thank you for being with us tonight for Book Notes. Be on the lookout for our next conversation, which will be coming soon. And we thank you for the Book Notes community that is growing every time we meet, of people who really want to delve into these issues and hear from Black authors and scholars and expand their world. So have a wonderful night, be blessed, and don't forget to pick up Flaming. God bless.